That motorcycle belongs in a museum, not with someone like you. The words cut through the auction hall like shattering glass. All eyes turned toward the weathered man in the faded leather jacket, his calloused hands trembling slightly as he lowered his bidding paddle. Around him, polished shoes shifted on marble floors, designer watches gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and uncomfortable smiles flickered across faces worth millions. The auctioneer, in his tailored suit and practiced smile, didn't even try to hide his disdain. Perhaps Sir would be more comfortable at the public viewings rather than the bidding floor. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Nobody noticed the man in the corner, baseball cap pulled low, watching everything with increasing interest. The Beverly Hills Vintage Motorcycle Auction was the event of the season, where machines weren't just vehicles but status symbols with six-figure price tags. The 1972 Harley-Davidson currently on display gleamed under spotlights, its chrome restored to mirror perfection. To most attendees, it represented an investment opportunity or a trophy for their collection. But to Frank Reeves, the 72-year-old former mechanic standing awkwardly in his best but worn clothes, it was something else entirely. He'd sold that very bike 30 years ago when his garage went under, recognizing the vehicle by the small dent on the fuel tank he'd never quite fixed. Now, after decades of saving, he'd come to reclaim a piece of his history, only to find himself drowning in a sea of wealth where he clearly didn't belong. Frank's fingers wrapped tightly around his bidding paddle, the number 47 blurring through tears he refused to let fall. This wasn't just about a motorcycle anymore, it was about dignity. The starting bid had already exceeded his life savings, but he remained rooted to his spot, a ghost at a feast of excess. The auctioneer's voice rose higher, the crowd grew more animated, and the humiliation burned deeper. In the back of the room, the quiet observer removed his sunglasses. Few recognized Keanu Reeves without the trademark John Wick suit or Constantine's trench coat. But the auction was about to take an unexpected turn that would go viral within hours, teaching a lesson about value that extended far beyond vintage motorcycles. The auctioneer's voice carried through the hall like a practiced symphony, each number rolling off his tongue with rehearsed precision. Do I hear 80,000? 80,000 from the gentleman in the Brioni suit? Excellent taste, sir. Now 90? 90,000 for this exquisite piece of American engineering history? Frank clutched his paddle so tightly, his knuckles whitened. The Harley glistened on its rotating platform, chrome and leather spinning under theatrical lighting designed to maximize desire and loosen wallets. He recognized every curve, every detail, the slight scratch near the throttle, from the time his daughter had played with his keys, the almost imperceptible dent he'd gotten the first week of ownership on a gravel road outside Tulsa. Stories and memories embedded in metal that nobody else in the room could see or value. Around him, the crowd of collectors and investors buzzed with the peculiar energy unique to wealth, the casual confidence of people accustomed to getting what they want. They wore their entitlement like cologne, too strong and impossible to ignore. A woman with diamond earrings the size of grapes whispered to her companion, not bothering to lower her voice enough. I don't understand why they let just anyone in these events. It used to be exclusive. Her companion nodded, casting a dismissive glance toward Frank's weathered jacket and faded jeans. Frank pretended not to hear, but each word landed like a physical blow, each snicker another reminder that he didn't belong. The bidding escalated rapidly, numbers climbing like smoke, disappearing into the rarefied air of luxury. 100,000. Do I hear 110? Frank's heart sank further with each increment. His maximum, every dollar he'd managed to save over 3 decades of working overtime in other people's garages after his own failed, was $72,000. A fortune to him, pocket change to the men and women casually raising paddles around him, but still he stayed, transfixed by the motorcycle that had once been his companion through 3 states and countless memories. The auctioneer noticed Frank's hesitation and the paddle that hadn't been raised in several rounds. His smile tightened with professional disapproval. "Sir, if you're no longer actively bidding, perhaps you could step aside for serious buyers." The suggestion carried just enough politeness to mask the insult beneath, but everyone understood the subtext. A few people chuckled. Someone muttered about tourists at professional events. Frank's face flushed hot with embarrassment. He was 62 years too old to be humiliated like a schoolboy, too proud to slink away, too stubborn to give up. "I'll bid again when it comes back down to my range," he replied, voice steady despite the emotion behind it. This drew outright laughter from several corners. The auctioneer's eyebrows arched with theatrical dismay. "I can assure you, sir, nothing at this auction will be coming down." In the back of the room, Keanu Reeves shifted position slightly. Unlike many celebrities who demanded attention the moment they entered a space, he had perfected the art of quiet observation. Dressed in simple dark jeans and a plain jacket, he blended with the security personnel and assistants that hovered at the periphery of such events. His passion for motorcycles was well known among enthusiasts. His own company, Arch Motorcycle, created custom bikes for those who appreciated engineering excellence over flash. But today, he was here simply as a lover of vintage machines, curious about what might appear on the auction block. What had caught his attention wasn't the gleaming Harley, impressive though it was. It was the weathered man with calloused hands and the proud set to his shoulders despite the mocking laughter directed his way. There was a story there written in the man's eyes whenever he looked at the motorcycle. In Keanu's experience, those who looked at bikes with that mixture of reverence and personal history were the ones who truly understood their value, not as status symbols or investments, but as companions on life's journey. The auctioneer's voice grew more animated. "Do I hear 120,000? 120 from the gentleman in the front row. 130? Yes. 130 from the phone bidder." The numbers were climbing beyond reasonable value now, driven by competition rather than appreciation. Frank's expression hardened, a muscle working in his jaw. His fingers still clutched his paddle, though it hadn't been raised in several rounds. Around him, the atmosphere grew increasingly uncomfortable, his presence an unwelcome reminder of a world outside the bubble of privilege. A younger man in an expensive suit, Italian cut, diamond cufflinks that caught the light with every gesture, sidled up to Frank, champagne flute dangling carelessly between manicured fingers. "Fascinating piece, isn't it?" he remarked, voice dripping with condescension. "I'm considering adding it to my collection, though I don't actually ride. Too dangerous, you understand." He laughed, a practiced sound designed to invite agreement rather than express genuine amusement. "These things are best kept behind glass. Appreciate in value that way." Frank's weathered face remained impassive, but something dangerous flickered behind his eyes. "A motorcycle that doesn't run is just expensive furniture," he replied, voice low and graveled by years of life. "That Harley was made to eat up miles of open road, not collect dust in some showroom." The young collector's smile faltered slightly. "You speak as if you know this particular machine." "I do." Frank's voice softened with memory. "I put over 80,000 miles on that bike, rode it to my daughter's college graduation in '88, took my wife's ashes to the Grand Canyon on it in '93, because that's where we'd had our honeymoon. That little dent on the left side of the tank happened outside Albuquerque when I had to lay it down to avoid hitting a coyote." His calloused finger pointed toward an imperfection, barely visible under the spotlight's glare. The collector's expression shifted from amusement to discomfort. Others nearby had paused their conversations to listen. The auction continued around them, the price now hovering at $140,000. If you loved it so much, the collector asked, with the cruel curiosity of someone who has never had to make difficult financial choices, why did you sell it in the first place? Frank's gaze remained on the motorcycle, pride warring with the shame of old wounds reopened. My garage went under in '94, economy tanked, and I had medical bills after my wife's cancer. Had to sell everything, right down to my tools. The pain of those memories still fresh even decades later. Been working as a mechanic for other people ever since, saving up, hoping someday I might. His voice trailed off as the auctioneer's gavel struck again. 150,000 from the gentleman on the phone. Do I hear 160? The collector snorted, emboldened by the rising price. Well, seems like it's found its proper place in the world now, with people who can afford to maintain such treasures. He raised his paddle casually. 160. The gesture was so effortless, as if the additional $10,000 meant nothing, which to him it likely didn't. Frank's hands trembled slightly, not with age, but with barely contained emotion. Around them, the crowd had grown more attentive to this small drama unfolding at the edge of the auction. Phone cameras had appeared, discreetly at first and then more openly as people sensed the potential for social media content. The contrast was irresistible, the weathered former owner in his work-worn clothes versus the gleaming excess of the auction house elite. You don't even ride, Frank said, voice quiet but carrying through a sudden lull in the background chatter. You're buying memories you never had, experiences you'll never understand. That bike carried me through the hardest years of my life. It's not some trophy to lock away. The collector's face hardened, embarrassment transforming to anger at being challenged publicly. Listen, old man, that's how the world works. Things go to people who can afford them. His voice rose, drawing more attention. If you wanted to keep your precious bike, maybe you should have made better financial decisions. Not my fault you couldn't hack it as a business owner. A security guard began moving toward them, sensing the escalating tension. The auctioneer, consummate professional that he was, continued without missing a beat. 160,000 from the gentleman in the blue suit. Do I hear 170? 170, came a quiet voice from the back of the room. Heads turned, conversations faltered. The auctioneer squinted past the bright lights. Yes, 170,000 from... He faltered as recognition dawned on his face. Keanu Reeves had removed his cap, stepping slightly forward into the light. His presence created an immediate ripple through the crowd, whispers, a few gasps of recognition, the distinctive sound of dozens of phone cameras activating simultaneously. The collector who had been taunting Frank suddenly looked uncertain, caught between his desire for the motorcycle and the unexpected entry of a celebrity into the bidding. The auctioneer recovered quickly, professionalism reasserting itself through his surprise. 170,000 from Mr. Keanu Reeves. There was a new energy in his voice now. The presence of a celebrity bidder transformed the auction from a mere sales event into an entertainment spectacle. Do I hear 180? The collector hesitated, caught in a sudden social calculation. Outbidding an anonymous phone caller was one thing, publicly competing against a beloved actor was another matter entirely, particularly with so many recording devices now trained in their direction. But ego won out. He raised his paddle. 180. A slight smile crossed Keanu's face as he countered immediately. 200,000. His voice was calm, but carried effortlessly through the now hushed auction hall. The collector's expression tightened. 220. 250, Keanu replied without hesitation. Frank watched this exchange with a mixture of emotions playing across his weathered features, resignation that the bike was now completely beyond his reach, but also a vindicated satisfaction seeing the arrogant collector forced to stretch beyond his comfort zone. The price had now far exceeded the motorcycle's market value, driven by ego and the audience's palpable anticipation. The collector's jaw worked silently for a moment, $275, he finally said, voice strained. Keanu simply nodded. $300,000. The room erupted in murmurs. The auctioneer's eyes gleamed with dollar signs as he looked between the two bidders. I have $300,000 from Mr. Reeves. Going once. He paused dramatically, eyes fixed on the collector. The man's face had flushed red. He looked around at the crowd, at the phones recording his every reaction, at Frank's stoic expression, and finally at Keanu's impassive face. The social dynamics had shifted. Continuing would make him appear desperate, foolish for overpaying so dramatically for a bike worth perhaps half the current bid. With a dismissive gesture that failed to mask his frustration, he shook his head. Going twice. The auctioneer continued, gavel raised. And sold to Mr. Keanu Reeves for $300,000. Applause rippled through the room. Phones remained up, recording, streaming. The collector slipped away, muttering about publicity stunts to save face. Frank stood frozen, uncertain what had just happened or why. And Keanu began making his way through the crowd toward the front of the room, people parting before him like water. Keanu approached the auction podium with an unhurried grace that somehow commanded more attention than any dramatic entrance could have achieved. The room had transformed. What had been a sterile transaction of wealth was now electrified with expectation. Staff rushed to process his unexpected purchase, clipboards and forms materializing as if by magic. The Harley gleamed under the lights, chrome and leather, now imbued with celebrity association that would undoubtedly increase its value even further. "If you could just sign here, Mr. Reeves," the auction house manager gushed, extending a pen that probably cost more than Frank's monthly rent. "We can arrange shipping to any location you prefer, of course. Our white glove service ensures that—" "That won't be necessary," Keanu interrupted gently, accepting the pen but not the clipboard. Instead, he turned to scan the crowd, finding Frank, who remained rooted to his spot, face a complex mixture of emotions. With a small gesture, Keanu beckoned him forward. "Sir, would you mind joining me up here?" A confused murmur rippled through the audience. Frank hesitated, suddenly self-conscious of his worn boots on the polished floor, the eyes of the wealthy fixed upon him with curiosity, and in some cases, lingering disdain. But something in Keanu's expression, a simple human respect, gave him the courage to move forward. He approached slowly, back straight, despite the arthritis that had been his companion for the last decade. The auction house manager looked between them with growing confusion. "Mr. Reeves, we still need to process the paperwork for your purchase." "About that," Keanu said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "I have a few questions about this motorcycle's history." He turned to Frank. "You mentioned earlier that you were the original owner, that you put 80,000 miles on it." Frank nodded, finding his voice. "Bought it new in '72. Had it for 22 years before I had to sell it." "And that dent on the fuel tank, that happened near Albuquerque, avoiding a coyote?" Frank's eyes widened slightly. "You heard that?" "I did." Keanu smiled, that particular gentle expression that had endeared him to millions. Then, addressing the room more broadly, "I think there's been a mistake here today." The auction house manager's professional smile faltered. "A mistake? I assure you, Mr. Reeves, all our items are authenticated and—" "Not that kind of mistake," Keanu interrupted gently. "A mistake in how we value things." His voice remained soft, but in the hushed room, everyone could hear him clearly. Phone cameras continued recording, live streams buffering out to thousands of viewers beyond the physical space. "This motorcycle isn't just metal and chrome and engineering. It's a vessel for memories, for life." He turned to Frank, genuine interest in his expression. "What was the longest trip you ever took on this bike?" Frank's weathered face softened with memory. 1976. My wife and I rode from Oklahoma to California and back. 3 weeks on the road. No real plan, just following wherever the day took us. His calloused hand reached out, not quite touching the motorcycle, hovering above it, with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. We slept under the stars most nights. Nancy kept a journal of every small town we passed through. "And this is the exact same motorcycle? You're certain?" Frank nodded, pointing to a barely visible mark on the handlebar. "I scratched my initials here, under the grip, FR, and there's a repair on the exhaust pipe I did myself after a minor crash outside Phoenix." Keanu crouched down, examining the areas Frank indicated, nodding as he found the confirmation. When he straightened, his expression had changed, now filled with a quiet determination that those familiar with his films would recognize. He turned to the auction house manager. "I'd like to change the terms of this purchase." The manager blinked rapidly, caught between the desire to accommodate a celebrity and the rigid protocols of high-end auctions. "Sir, I'm not sure what you mean. The sale is final at $300,000. "I understand that," Keanu said, "and I'm happy to pay that amount, but I'm not the one who should own this motorcycle." The whispers grew louder. Social media alerts began pinging on phones throughout the room as the live streams gained viewers. The manager's professional veneer cracked further. "Mr. Reeves, I don't understand what you're suggesting." Keanu placed a hand lightly on Frank's shoulder. "I'd like to purchase this motorcycle as planned, but then transfer ownership immediately to Mr." He paused, realizing he didn't know Frank's last name. "Reeves," Frank supplied. "Frank Reeves." A surprised murmur ran through the crowd, followed by scattered laughter at the coincidence of their shared surname. Keanu's eyes crinkled. "No relation, I assume?" "Not that I know of," Frank replied, a hint of a smile finally breaking through his stoic expression. "Well, Mr. Reeves," Keanu continued, "sometimes the universe gives us these little signs." He turned back to the manager. "As I was saying, I'll complete the purchase, but I want the motorcycle transferred immediately to Frank Reeves, at no cost to him." The manager stammered, "That's highly unusual." "So am I, from what I hear," Keanu replied with that characteristic self-deprecating humor that had made him an internet darling. The crowd laughed, tension breaking. "Please draw up whatever paperwork is necessary. I'm purchasing it, but Mr. Reeves will be taking it home today." Frank's expression transformed through disbelief to understanding and finally to overwhelming emotion. "I can't accept that," he said, voice rough. "It's too much. $300,000 is what I chose to pay for the privilege of returning this bike to its rightful owner," Keanu finished for him. Then, more quietly, for Frank alone, though the microphones caught it anyway, "Some things are worth more than money. The stories we live, the journeys we take, those are the real treasures." The wealthy audience shifted uncomfortably, some moved by the gesture, others confronted by a valuation system that challenged their own. The collector who had been bidding against Keanu earlier had slipped entirely out of the room, unable to face the end of this particular story. The auction house manager, recognizing the unstoppable momentum of what was happening, and perhaps more importantly, the spectacular publicity it was generating, finally acquiesced. "Very well, Mr. Reeves. We'll prepare the transfer documents immediately." As staff rushed to accommodate this unprecedented request, Frank stood speechless beside his long-lost motorcycle, hand finally making contact with the leather seat he'd broken in decades ago. The room erupted into applause, genuine this time, not the polite golf claps of social requirement, but the spontaneous recognition of having witnessed something extraordinary. Outside the auction house, past the glass doors and security personnel, a small crowd had gathered. The story was already spreading through social media like wildfire. #KeanuBike trending within minutes. Video clips accumulating millions of views. Reporters materialized as if summoned by some invisible alert system that activated whenever genuine human moments broke through the carefully manufactured narratives of celebrity life. Frank stood beside his motorcycle in the warm California afternoon sun, still processing the reality of what had just happened. The leather seat was warm beneath his palm, the chrome reflecting his weathered face. Some things change over 30 years, and some things don't. The connection between man and machine remained unbroken despite the decades of separation. "She still runs beautifully," the auction house mechanic assured him, handing over the key. "Completely restored to factory specifications." Frank nodded, but there was a slight hesitation in his movement. Keanu, who had been quietly signing forms nearby, noticed immediately. "Something wrong?" he asked, stepping closer. Frank ran his fingers over the two perfect handlebars, the pristine leather seat. "It's beautiful work," he acknowledged, "but they erased all the wear, all the evidence of the journeys." He touched the freshly painted fuel tank where the tiny dent from Albuquerque had been expertly removed. "It's like they erased the stories." Keanu considered this, nodding slowly. "The stories are still there," he said. "They just went beneath the surface, like memories." He smiled, that particular gentle expression that had made him beloved to millions. "And now you can add new stories." Frank's eyes glistened slightly in the sunlight. "I'm not sure how to thank you properly." "No need," Keanu replied, waving away the gratitude with genuine discomfort at being the center of attention. "Just enjoy the ride." A reporter pushed forward through the gathering crowd, microphone extended eagerly. "Mr. Reeves, can you tell us why you spent $300,000 on a motorcycle only to give it away?" Keanu hesitated, his natural inclination toward privacy at war with the opportunity to share something meaningful. Frank, sensing his reluctance, surprised everyone by answering instead. "He didn't give away a motorcycle," Frank said, voice steady, despite all the cameras now trained on him. "He gave back a piece of someone's life. There's a difference." The simple dignity in his words caused a momentary silence among the chattering press corps. Keanu nodded appreciatively at Frank, then addressed the gathered reporters. "Look, the world puts price tags on everything, what something costs versus what it's worth. But the most valuable things can't be bought or sold. They're earned through living." He gestured toward Frank and the motorcycle. "This bike isn't just transportation or a collector's item. It's a companion on the journey. It belongs with someone who understands that." The video of Keanu's impromptu philosophy lesson, intercut with footage from inside the auction, reached 50 million views by midnight. Comment sections overflowed with emotions ranging from admiration to tears to renewed faith in humanity. For a brief cultural moment, the gesture transcended celebrity news to become something people discussed in coffee shops and dinner tables, a reminder about value that resonated in a world increasingly defined by price tags and status symbols. 1 week later, Frank Reeves pulled into his daughter's driveway in Oklahoma, having ridden the Harley across 3 states. The journey had been slower than in his younger days, with more frequent stops for his aging back, but the joy had been undimmed by time or circumstance. His daughter, now in her 50s herself, came running out like a child, phone camera already recording. "Dad, you're all over the internet. Mr. Reeves has been trying to reach you." Frank smiled, patting the motorcycle's fuel tank affectionately as he dismounted. New memories had already joined the old. The sunset over the Arizona desert, the thunderstorm he'd waited out in a small-town diner, the conversations with curious strangers at gas stations who recognized the famous bike. He had left behind a small dent near the kickstand when he'd parked carelessly outside Flagstaff. Not every mark was a mistake. Some were just evidence of a life being lived. "Tell him the bike is perfect," Frank said, eyes crinkling at the corners, "and the road is still there waiting for anyone who wants to find what really matters."